All right, well, good morning, welcome. My name is Logan, and it's wonderful to welcome you here to this Relevant Series event. We're particularly excited to have ABDU MURRAY be joining us. He'll be speaking on the topic, Are All Religions Basically the Same? And just by way of introduction, I'm going to read some of the questions that we wanted to ask ABDU about and hope he addresses in the course of his talk. Aren't all religions beautiful myths based on faith that all teach basically the same thing? Be a good person, love your neighbor, care for the poor, practice justice. Isn't it bigoted and ethnocentric to say that one religion is more true to reality than another? Can tests of truth even be applied to religion? If so, what would they be? If religions don't teach all the same thing, and they're actually fundamentally different, yet superficially the same, where do they differ? And our speaker, as I've mentioned, is ABDU MURRAY, who joined us last night as well. ABDU MURRAY is the North American director of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. He's the author of the book, Grand Central Question, Answering the Critical Concerns of Major Worldviews, as well as the book, Apocalypse Later. For most of his life, ABDU was a proud Muslim who studied the Qur'an and Islam. After a 9-year investigation into the historical, philosophical, and scientific underpinnings of the major world religions, ABDU discovered that the historic Christian faith can alone answer the questions of the mind and the longings of the heart. ABDU holds a BA from the University of Michigan and earned his JD from the University of Michigan Law School. As an attorney, ABDU was named several times in Best Lawyers in America. We're going to have ABDU speak for a time, then we're going to move to a time of Q&A. And you'll see up here and on the screen, there's a number you can text your questions into. You can do that throughout the course of the talk, and we'll look forward to engaging in the discussion then. But please join me in welcoming ABDU MURRAY.
Thank you, Logan. Did I turn my thing on? Mike? Yeah, that's right. Good. We can all hear me? Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me this morning and having me here in lovely Toronto. I love coming here. I hail from Michigan, which means that I'm the only state, I believe, in the Union in the United States where Canada is the country to my south. The peninsula where Windsor and other cities are is directly to my south. And I remember being asked a question in grade school in geography lessons, what is the country to your south immediately? And everyone was saying Cuba or Venezuela or Colombia or whatever it was, and they were getting it all wrong. And the answer was, in fact, Canada. And so that's one of the unusual features of where I come from, among many other unusual features about Michigan. It's a great place. I'd love for you to visit us there. This question is such an interesting question. And having come from a different worldview before, a different religious system before, I actually went through and at some point was struggling with whether or not different religious systems have different answers to the fundamental questions of life. Thought for a time maybe they all have the same answers and they're all basically the same, and I needed to do that. See, I needed to have that view because if they had different answers, that meant I had to make a choice. There's a group of philosophers out of Canada, some very famous philosophers, the rock band Rush. They make a song called Free Will. And the singer, Geddy Lee, is singing the words, and he says, you may choose a ready guide in some celestial voice, but if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. No matter what we do, when we try to say, oh, they're all the same or whatever it is, you make the choice to either smooth over the differences for comfort's sake, or you embrace the differences because you are recognizing that all these religious traditions actually have a history that's worthy of your respect and worthy of your investigation. Now, that has real world implications, easy for me to say. I want to take you and tell you a story about a friend of mine and I. And if you've heard me speak before, you've heard this story, but I think it's worth talking about because of the questions of his heart. And he was looking at different systems and different worldviews and abandoned all of them in terms of religion to go to the atheistic framework because he found despair as all there was. So my friend and I were friends in school. And he was an agnostic, he would say. Really, when I talked to him, he pretty much said he had made up his mind pretty solidly that there was no God. But we didn't really talk about matters of religion very much. which is unusual because I talk with everybody about religion. That's what I did. When I was a Muslim, and now that I'm a Christian still, I do this. I talk to people about religion. My favorite topic is God and how we relate to God. But somehow we didn't have that conversation in school. Well, we had both graduated, went our separate ways, and then I got married, and I invited him to my wedding. He was in some other state. He flew in for the wedding. We had a great time together, but we didn't have a lot of time to talk because, as you know, weddings go. If you haven't already been married, you'll find this out at your wedding. You can talk to everybody for about 5 minutes, and that's all you get. So we didn't have a whole lot of time to talk. So he had discovered something was weird, though. He's like, when you were in school, you were a Muslim, and I got the subtle hint that you're not one anymore because your wedding was at a church, and you prayed to Jesus, and you took communion. So I got this subtle idea that I think something changed. So a couple of years later, actually, after my wedding, he calls me up, and he says, hey, I'm going to be in town on a business trip. I'd love to get together, have dinner, and just catch up. I said, great, if you pay, I'll pray. And he said, good, we'll do that. So we got together. And it was a nice, fancy restaurant because it was a business expense for him. So I picked a really nice one, and we had a great time together. And we caught up on family and other things and all these kind of things. And he said, I got to ask you, though, all right, what happened? How did that happen? And I told him the story. From the historical to the philosophical to the religious and theological things that drove me to see that in fact it was the Christian message that was the one that answered the questions of my mind and the ones that stalked my heart. And he said, here, look, I have a problem though. My problem, you've already heard some great speakers talking about this. I can't believe in a God that allows suffering and evil. If God was all powerful, he would want to stop the suffering. If he was all powerful, he would be able to stop the suffering. If he was all good, he would want to stop the suffering, yet the suffering still exists. So either he's not all good and doesn't want to stop it, or he's not all powerful because he can't stop it, or more likely, he's not even there. Now, he wasn't doing it as a gotcha. We were talking academically at this point. So I answered him academically and started going into some of the theodicies. A theodicy is simply a way to sort of reconcile God's existence with evil. We've been doing it for centuries. And the good news is that largely, logically speaking, this is a dead issue. Emotionally speaking, or even existentially, it's not a dead issue. Clearly it's not. But that's a great question, isn't it? I mean, it's one that we've been talking about this whole week, the issue of suffering. And for some of us, it's a very personal thing, and it was very personal for him. But he was speaking academically, so I went into it academically with him. And I said, look, there's 5 answers or so to this issue. We ended up centering on one. I said, if God exists, then that means that he would know all things. He would know all past things, all present things, all future things, and all future, what are called counterfactuals in philosophy, but all future possible things. In other words, God knows what you would have done if you didn't come here today. He knows what would have happened had you not come, and the billions of things that would have transpired or could have transpired based on your choices. There's all these things. God knows all. He says, okay, theoretically, if God exists, that's possible. I said, well, then, if that's possible, then isn't it at least likely that God could allow suffering to happen in the world at some instance, whether large or small, for a greater possible good throughout the spiderweb of future history that you and I will never know because we are not omniscient? And he said, no, not possible. I said, wait, not possible? He said, no, because how can you tell me that God could allow that suffering that happened after the tsunami in 2004 in the Indian Ocean? How can you tell me something good will come of it? And I said, wait a minute, you're telling me that you know no possible greater good can come from that 50,000 years from now? He's like, well, I can't see it. I said, well, if you're telling me you know that, then you are claiming to have all knowledge of the future. You're claiming to be omniscient, and you're using your omniscience to disprove the existence of a being who's omniscient. He got it. I said, okay, I get it. But here's my real question. By this time, everybody had left. The restaurant was empty, except for the waitstaff who couldn't wait for the Martians to leave. And we were there at the table, and he looked up from his now cold coffee, and they weren't filling it up anymore because they're like, if we give these guys more caffeine, they'll keep staying. He looks up from his cold coffee, and he says to me with a look that's completely different. He said, I want to know how this God is good and values me or my mother when he let her die of cancer when I was 10. It's the exact same question. But now the philosophical rubber has met the existential road. And the answer is no longer academic. It's got to matter to him in a way that touches his mind, but also touches his heart. What do you do? Well, how do you answer? All the religious systems in the world are trying to give us answers not only to how reality works, but how we fit in the grand story. These are what I call the grand central questions. That's what the book is all about. How do you affirm the questions while providing an answer that touches the mind and touches the heart? I'm firmly convinced only the gospel does that. We're looking for relevance. And irrelevant, by the way, doesn't mean flashy packaged or well-spoken. Something is true. There are plenty of truths that are relevant to our lives, but only in tangential ways. For example, water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. That's true. And it's relevant if you're in the lab. But did you wake up this morning thanking God for that particular fact? I'm so thankful that water boils at 100 degrees centigrade instead of 101. You didn't do that, right? It wasn't like something that you jumped for joy about. But the questions that stalk our minds are these questions, and all the religious systems in the world, the various ones, from Islam, in the monotheistic traditions of Judaism and Islam, to the pantheistic religions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism, and all the other isms that are out there on the eastern side, to the Western iterations of that, the ones that you and I are probably even more familiar with than you realize, like the New Age issues, the new spirituality of Oprah and Chopra and Eckhart Tolle and all these folks, and Scientology. They're all claiming to have answers to these deep, fundamental questions, and the culture is telling you they're all basically the same answer, and I'm here to tell you that is absolutely not true. Not true. In fact, what I would tell you is this, that Jesus makes a specific claim. He makes claims, multiple claims. In fact, let me read them for you. He specifically says in John chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, A, did he really say that? And history tells us that he really did, in fact, say that on multiple occasions. And B, was he right? See, he's making a very reasonable statement. He's saying there is a truth, and that truth can be known, and truth, by definition, is exclusive because it excludes all those things which are false. Truth, by definition, has boundaries. It's not up for grabs. When that happens, it ceases to be truth. Now it becomes opinion. And opinions, well, who cares about opinions? You can cast those off as you walk down the street. But truth has an anchor. And Jesus makes this statement, he is the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes to the Father. No one has the salvation except through him. His disciples understood this. In Acts chapter 4, verse 12, his disciple Peter says, and there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Now, you could say these men are wrong. That's fine. The question is, they're not being unreasonable. Are they being unreasonable in claiming to be exclusive in these ways? Let me share with you a couple of ways in which I can say that religious systems, all of them, every one is exclusive. Every one of them. From those who claim to be the most inclusive, like a Hindu faith or a Buddhist faith or the Baha'i faith. Baha'is believe in progressive revelation, in that while there were, in fact, revelations that came to people before from the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Qur'an itself and all these things, it's progressive, and all of them have a version of the truth, and we're getting there kind of a thing. This actually ultimately results in exclusion. Because think about this, if you're an inclusivist, everyone's right, and then I come along and tell you, no, that's not true, only one person is right, you have disagreed with me, you have excluded the exclusivists. It's exclusive, and there's no way around it. Let me give you an illustration of this. I was giving my story, my testimony of my journey from Islam to Christ to a men's breakfast, a very large gathering, and there was a guy sitting in the front who was taking furious notes. I mean, smoke was arising from the pad of paper. I thought we were going to have to evacuate the building. And he was going like this and just furiously writing. And I can always tell that person is usually the first person after I get done talking who will gather and ask the questions. I can't wait. I love that. And so, sure enough, I got done. And during my course of my discussion, I was talking about how I came to faith in Christianity not because other things were false, but because the gospel is true. By implication, everything that sets itself against the gospel, I believe is false. But I don't harp on that. I harp on what's true. People don't accept something because something else is false. By default, we don't do that. You come to something because it's true, not because it's convenient. At least you shouldn't. We often do favor convenience over that, but that's another story. So after I got done speaking, sure enough, the guy was the first one to talk to me. And he came up to me and he said, I want to show you something. Can I show you something? Which always means this is going to take a while. And he had a diagram. And the diagram had a capital T, a big T in the middle of the paper with a circle around it. And around that, surrounded around that, were little lowercase t's that all had circles around them. So a circle of t's around the big T with arrows going towards it. He said, this is truth, ultimate truth. We don't have all of it. I'm like, so far, I'm with you. You agree that there's ultimate truth, and we don't have all of it. So far, I'm with you. If I had all the truth, if I knew all of it, well, then I'd be God, and I'm certainly not, so same page. Good, let's go. He says, but all of us, regardless of our worldview, have a version of the truth, as incomplete as it may be. We have a version of the truth, and we're all striving to get to, and ultimately we'll have the full truth once we're fully enlightened and we reach whatever state we have to reach. I said, all of us? Every one of us has a version of the truth? And he said, yeah. I said, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin. They all have a version of the truth? This is what he said to me. I can't tell you that I prefer their version, I don't, but I can't say it's wrong. And I asked him, are you telling me that you can't disagree with anybody? He says, that's right, I can't disagree with anybody because we're all on the same path and all this. And I said, you can't disagree with anybody? He said, that's right. I said, sure you can. He says, no, I can't. I said, you just did it. Now I set him up. And intentionally so. Very, very bright guy, by the way. I'm a lawyer, I know how to do that. Afterwards, I'm walking outside, and there he was by his car saying, if I can't disagree with anybody, but I disagree with him, can I disagree with anybody? And he's doing that. The point is this, is that when we come to this idea that all religions are basically the same, we lose our ability to actually reason through the actual claims made by these religious systems. Maybe you've heard this phrase, all roads lead to God. Maybe you've heard it. In fact, maybe you've said it. And here's the thing about that. In saying that all roads lead to God, you're disrespecting every road, because not all roads even claim to. When you take a look at some of the Eastern religious systems, classical Buddhism, for example, Buddha did not teach that you become God or one with the universe. He actually preached there is no such thing as a self. Not only do you not get to God, there is no God to get to. In fact, there is no you. That's what he taught. Now, if you say all roads lead to God, you're insulting his teachings because he directly contradicts what you say. In an effort to give sort of a compliment to everybody, you actually end up insulting everybody. In Islam, you don't get to be with God. You get to go face to face with God and get judged by God. But the heaven that is created in Islam is a garden of bliss. And it is wonderfully described in the Qur'an in so many ways. But you don't get to be with God. He does not commune with you. That's exactly what heaven is in Christianity. You get to be with God. That's the whole point, is that communion. So when we say all roads lead to God, we're forgetting something. They don't even claim to. They don't even claim to. See, what ends up happening is insulting all religious systems, we're not taking them seriously. And so I would tell you this. In fact, in the pantheistic views, like Hinduism, for example, you don't get to be with God. You actually are God. You are, the Atman is Brahman. There's the creative force, the all is one, and all is God idea. So it's not communion, there's actually becoming through enlightenment. So these are all, we have to respect these ideas. Buddha started Buddhism in rejection of certain Hindu doctrines. To say that Buddhists and Hindus are the same thing and believe the same thing is to disrespect the traditions of both. So we can't do this. We have to allow people what I call the dignity of difference. I would never insult a Muslim by saying, you and I believe the same thing. A Muslim would never say, God is triune. Never. One God with three persons, they'd never say that. And why would I disrespect them by telling them, well, it's the same thing. We believe the same things about God. We believe in one God. We believe that there is one God, just like Muslims do. But what is he like is important. It's not trivial. They don't believe that he would die on a cross and come and condescend to be with us. They don't believe that. So why would I insult them by saying they do? They're all basically the same. I wouldn't do that. And these things play out. Somehow they play out. Let's go into the suffering issue, if I could, just for a moment, and see in one aspect There's no way in 25 minutes that I can possibly describe to you every aspect in which they're different. Oftentimes people say religions are superficially different but fundamentally the same. It's exactly the opposite. Religions are fundamentally different and superficially the same. So let's delve into one of these issues. When you look at suffering as an example, every religious system, and non-religious system, by the way, even secular systems, try to deal with the idea of suffering. And because we're talking about religions, I won't go into the secular issues here. But let me just go back to the religious systems. When you look at the religions of the East, and I'm particularly going to give you examples, I think, of what the Eastern religions have to offer, and then how they're translated here in the West for sort of Western consumption, is suffering is a foremost issue. Try to deal with it all the time. When you look at what Buddha actually taught, from the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path that he taught, suffering is central. It's a central issue in all of these things. He specifically says in the teachings, and here it is, that life is suffering. Suffering is caused by craving or desire. And suffering will cease when we cease desiring, and we can only cease desiring if we follow the Eightfold Path. So suffering is caused by desire. We have to cease desire. Desire ceases when we follow the Eightfold Path. Suffering is a big issue here, but as is quite common to Eastern pantheistic religion, the idea that comes here is that the suffering is not a result of actual suffering, it's more illusory than anything else. It's the lila, it's the play, and backstage is where the real stuff is, because we're under the illusion that we either A, have a self, and we're connected to other selves, and that causes the illusion of attachment, which causes the illusion of suffering, because you lose things, you lose attachments, people break away from you in relationships, you lose stuff and property, so break away from those attachments. Or, in another strand of Eastern religion, you have the illusion that you're not God, that you are an individual soul, and that you actually are God himself. Not a God, by the way. You are the God, and so am I. And we have an illusion of our separateness. We're actually not separate beings. Everything is divine. And through a process of death and reincarnation and working off your karma or doing the yoga or doing devotions and various strands of ways to do this, you'll eventually realize this. It could take you 1,000 lifetimes, could take you 1,000,000 lifetimes. You're going to eventually realize this and become absorbed into the Brahman. So suffering is central, because the suffering is an illusion brought upon by the greater illusion that you are not divine or that you are a self. So the claim is that suffering is an illusion that we need to escape from. Listen to the words of Eckhart Tolle, who, in a very confused way, I believe, a Westerner who has taken Buddhist ideas and Hindu ideas, sort of smashed them together in a very popular book, made popular by Oprah Winfrey, actually, called The Power of Now. Talking about suffering, he says this: enlightenment, consciously chosen, means to relinquish your attachment to past and future and make the now the main focus of your life. It means choosing to dwell in the state of presence rather than in time. It means saying yes to what is. You then don't need pain anymore. How much more time do you think you will need before you are able to say, I will create no more pain, no more suffering? How much more pain do you think you will need before you are able to make that choice? Now, it's important you hear what he's saying. He's saying, we need to relinquish. Enlightenment comes from relinquishing our attachments to the past and to the future and focus on the now. Don't worry about the past. We are riddled with anxiety about the past. Stop worrying about the future and being riddled with anxiety about the future. Dwell in the now. And then when you lose that attachment, suddenly things will become focused and clear, and you don't need pain anymore, he says, and then you can choose to lose the pain. My response, this is my response in all sincerity. I want to ask, is that serious? Can you be serious? And this is not a pejorative thing. I'm actually asking the question. Can you be serious? Because if you look in the face, you remember this had happened in the United States when the Newtown, Connecticut massacre happened, when a guy walked in and killed 26 people, including 20 children, by gun, shot them all dead. Can you look into the face of one of those parents and say, oh, don't focus on the past you had with that child, or the future you'll never have with that child, the graduations you won't go to, the marriages you won't celebrate. Don't focus on that. Focus on the now, and you won't need pain anymore. Come on. Give me a break. That loss they feel is the signal of their value. Pain tells you something is valuable. If you lose something and you feel nothing, then it meant nothing to you. Pain is the signal of intrinsic value. It's not an illusion. The cross tells me and tells you that suffering is such a real thing in human endeavors that there's actually the one who creates all of humanity, creates all the world, and creates everything, enters into our existence and actually experiences suffering to give you and me the dignity of knowing it's not an illusion. The creator of all reality himself experiences it so that you one day won't have to. It's not to be escaped from as illusory, it's to be delivered from. And the Bible even says it, that in that day he will wipe every tear from their eyes. You know, I take the connotation of that to mean God doesn't go like this and everyone suddenly feels good and there's no more tears. I get the connotation from the way the Bible describes the way the tears will be wiped from our eye. He walks right up to you, face to face, puts his thumb on your cheek, and wipes it. Fundamentally different. Fundamentally different. Then you go to the religion of Islam, for example. And I'm going to take these two examples only because they're the most prevalent counter-Christian or non-Christian examples. Islam has the idea of God's greatness built right into it. If you were here last night, you may have heard me talk about this. There's that phrase, Allahu Akbar, right? Allahu Akbar means God is great. God actually literally means God is greater. The literal translation is God is bigger, but the connotation is God is greater than all things. He's the greatest conceivable being. I remember I used to think that Christians were just like, they wanted to worship a God who was great, but they couldn't because their confusion of God makes that impossible. But how is God great in terms of Islamic theology, and how does it pertain to our issues? Well, the first thing is that God provides what amounts to tests in our lives. Sorry about that. Amounts to tests in our lives. He tests us through suffering, and that this is the primary reason for suffering, or we bring it upon ourselves, and we do in fact do that. I mean, we cause our own suffering all the time. But it's a test primarily to get you somewhere in terms of your obedience or lack thereof with God. It's a test. And God's greatness is somehow demonstrated through this. But what's interesting to me is in Islam's desire to talk about God's greatness, it talks about God being one, absolutely one in his nature, one in his person. He's an undifferentiated absolute. There is no differentiation within God. The Islamic philosophers of old days, of Al-Ghazali and Al-Kindi and Ibn Arabi and all these guys, they were always talking about how do we understand God's oneness from an Islamic perspective, and his undifferentiatedness is there. The Christian perspective says, no, God is one, but also has three divine and distinct persons in the Godhead, and that these exist in relationship to each other, and that this actually is a model for how we can deal with suffering, because one of the people of the Godhead, one of the persons, one of the consciousnesses becomes incarnate in Christ and walks this earth perfectly to bear the burdens that you and I can't bear because of the suffering we've actually justly deserved in many ways. He bears it for you and makes the payment to God the Father. So it's not a fake thing. The Son, God the Son, actually makes payment for us to God the Father, one being, two different persons who actually engage in a transaction where justice is meted on one and forgiveness is given to us. The Trinity actually makes sense of the idea of how suffering can be dealt with from a Christian perspective. But one of the things for our Muslims friends that I was hoping to express yesterday, and I hope I came across, is that from the Christian perspective, the Muslim desire to find God's greatness is a valid desire. It's the right desire. It's the right question. It's the right goal for those who are religiously minded. But how do we find that? And I remember where I was when I first discovered this about the Christian faith, is that how it pertains to you and me and our suffering is this way. God is great, fantastic. But in no other system of belief does God condescend to do something about your and my sin and your and my suffering. In every other religious system, God makes a lot of statements, a lot of laws about suffering and about sin and what to do. In Christianity, God doesn't just say something about suffering, God does something about suffering. He puts his money where his mouth is. His actions speak louder than his words, and his words speak quite loudly. And his actions are sort of the exclamation point at the end of it. What do I mean by this? Consider the idea of God's greatness. Love is the greatest ethic. It simply is the greatest ethic. There is no greater ethic than love. That's why the Bible says God is love, and why the Quran and other religious texts say God is loving, or the source of love. But it would follow naturally that the greatest possible being, who is God, would express the greatest possible ethic, which is love, in the greatest possible way. And what is the greatest possible way to express love? It's simply through self-sacrifice. You know someone truly loves you when they do something for you that hurts them. Self-sacrifice. If we're capable of that, ought not the greatest possible being be able to be capable of that? Of course, it would stand to reason. But God is not as good as we are. God is greater than we are. And Romans chapter 5, verse 8 says, that demonstrates this for us. See, you and I will sacrifice for those who love us back, maybe for a stranger, but you do not try to sacrifice your life or anything about you for someone who hates you. Your first inclination when you found out Osama bin Laden was dead was not saying, that's too bad, I wish I could take his place. That was not the first thing you thought of. It wasn't the first thing I thought of. Our love has limits. But God demonstrates his love for us, his greater love, his better love, his higher love, his infinite love, and that while we were sinners, enemies of God, Christ died for us. The greatest possible being, expressing the greatest possible ethic in the greatest possible way. And I've looked far and wide, friends, and I've never seen it anywhere but at the cross and that empty tomb. Go back to my friend, and then I'm going to close so we can have some Q&A. How did I answer my friend? Remember what his question was? How can you tell me God is good and values me or my mother when he let her die of cancer when I was 10? What do? Do you give more philosophy? No. At that point, you'd be insulting him. Maybe adding more injury. It's already happened. The way he asked me showed me that his atheism had not given him answers to this, because she died for nothing, essentially. She's just a machine that stopped functioning prematurely, in one sense. He's looking for the answers. Here's what I said, and there's no way to actually plan this kind of stuff sometimes. I think in many ways, from a Christian perspective, and that's where I come from, I think God gives you utterance to be able to say to somebody something that is a mind and heart touching thing. I prayed quickly, and I said this to him. I said, we've been talking for some time now, and you agreed that God could allow suffering for some greater possible good in the future. He says, yeah. Like he was a little bit testy with me because he thought I was going to use his mother as a philosophical argument. I said, it's a valid theory. It's perfectly philosophically valid. But that's what it is. It's a theory. And there's no way to actually give you comfort in that if it's just a theory. But any theist, someone who just believes in God, someone who is a Muslim, a Jew, some strands of the Eastern religious systems can tell you God works in mysterious ways, and he could use suffering for a greater possible good. Can I offer you something, though? Why, as a Christian, I have more than theory, more than just mere philosophy. I have actual history to tell me this happened, because God didn't just allow a theoretical thing to happen, suffering to happen for a greater possible good. He actually let his son undergo unspeakable suffering as a matter of actual fact, not for some theoretical good that might come about, but for the greatest good that could come about, the salvation of the world. Suffering for a greater possible good isn't a theory in the Christian state, in the Christian belief. It is an actuality. And you can trust that God will take your suffering for some greater possible good in the future, because God already has done it to himself. I said, you asked me one last question. You asked me, how can I know that God values me or my mother? I said, how do you know how valuable anything is? I have things in my home that are terribly valuable to me, wedding pictures and my kids' art projects and all these things. If there's a fire in my house, they're going to burn. I'm getting my wife and my kids out. I'm going to mourn their loss. But if my wife or my kids are stuck in the house, I will go back in there and risk my very life to save them. You know how valuable something is by how much you're willing to pay for it. And I told him, you can know you have an infinite value because the infinite God paid an infinite price to spend an eternity with you and with your mother. He offered that to her, and he offers that to you. And he looked at me, and he said, that is worth believing. Friends, I find it amazing that the word crux is the heart of the word crucifixion. Crux means the place where things come together and turn. For someone who's looking for human value, the cross demonstrates it. For someone who's looking for the escape of suffering in different religious traditions, the cross tells you it's not to be escaped, it's to be dealt with. And for someone who's looking for God's greatness, the cross tells you God is truly great because he proves it and does something about it. Are all religions the same? They try to address the same questions, but they don't come to the same answers. What I humbly want to ask you is this an answer worth believing? I'm going to pray, and then we can go into Q&A, as short as it might be. On your seat, by the way, as I pray, there is a response card. If something here has got you thinking, please you can check out Tell Me More or Uncover Study. And we'll be in touch with you to figure out what more might be something that you could look into. If you still have questions, if this has at least sparked your interest. But if you think maybe there's something more to this and that I need this, I'm not a Christian, but I want to become one. I want to give my life to Christ because he answers the deepest questions, then count me in. So when we pray, I'm not going to ask anybody to raise their hands, not going to ask anybody to come forward, not going to do anything like that. I'm simply going to ask you before you check a box, to check your heart and to check your mind and to see if in fact you've been spoken to. So as I do that, just consider that, and we'd love to get in contact with you. There's people here who want to form community and answer your deepest and most heartfelt needs. So let's pray. Father, I thank you, Lord, for the opportunity. I thank you for this university. I thank you for all the people who have come here, those who are Christians and not Christians, those who don't have belief in anything supernatural, but those who might have it and are doubting, from everyone in between, all the range, Lord. I thank you for them who have come and given me the dignity of hearing me. Those who agree or don't agree, I thank you that you've made them, and you've made them in your image. Father, I pray, Lord, that we take this in. Recognize our state before you, that we need saving from ourselves, and that you have done in history something to save us from the suffering that either we experience from others or that we ourselves cause, and that it has been dealt with at the cross, that you have given us a Savior. I pray, Lord, that there are those who come to understand this and actually embrace it, and if there are those who are questioning, that they come to see that they can ask their questions openly and honestly. We thank you, Father, for all that you've given to us and for the opportunities, the hearts and minds that are here today. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, guys. We'll take Q&A.
Abdu, we're going to move now to a time of Q&A. I'm going to invite up our two panelists who will be joining Abdu. The first is Dr. Kirk Durston, who is a scientist and a philosopher. He has a PhD in biophysics from the University of Guelph and an MA in philosophy from the University of Manitoba. For the past 33 years, Dr. Durston has served as a speaker and an author for the organization Power to Change, engaging with students on the relationships between science, faith, philosophy, within the context of the Christian faith. Michelle Tepper is an itinerant speaker with Ravi Zacharias Ministries. She speaks on a variety of topics related to the Christian faith, including on the problem of suffering, the character of God, as well as sex, relationships, and love. She studied theology at the University of Oxford and has served as a guest lecturer at the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. So, as we've mentioned, there's been a number up on the screen to text your questions in. That's something you can still do now or throughout the Q&A. I'm going to turn over Michelle to moderate this question and answer time.
Already come in? Yeah, thank you. And we love live questions as well, as particularly Abdu, who was like, people are going to be asking questions. So at any point, if you have a question, please feel free to put your hand up, and Logan will bring the mic to you. Abdu, I'm going to go ahead and ask you this first question, because I think it's directed to you. And then we'll go on from there. How can you know if your belief is true if you have never explored every single belief?
Yeah, great question, because it betokens a concern that there's so many out there. The menu is long, right, and varied. And so how can you be sure, if you haven't exhausted all possibilities, that in your lifetime you won't be able to do that? And you simply won't. I've studied these things for years and years, and I still haven't exhausted my full search. I think the way to do that is to look at how we have tests for truth. The first test for truth, or one of the tests for truth, is what's called the correspondence theory of truth. How do you know that what the claims that are being made about a certain religious system or non-religious system actually correspond to the way the world actually is? If you have a system of belief, or you counter one that does not correspond to reality, then it's not worthy of your belief because it doesn't tell you anything about your existence. It needs to correspond to reality. So if something's telling you that the earth is flat, and I can't think of any religious system where that's fundamental to the religious system, then you should already know, maybe I shouldn't trust this system. It already does not correspond to reality as we know it. But the converse is also true. If you find a religious system that does correspond to reality in some very, very fundamental and foundational ways, now at least that part of it is ticked off. You actually can check that box. That one actually does correspond to reality, and at least it's got the credibility to keep investigating it further. So you can eliminate a whole lot of worldviews based on whether or not they correspond to reality. One of the ways, in fact, I think the Christian faith corresponds to reality is its unique statement about what human beings are. You know, C.S. Lewis has this in the Screw Tape Letters where he has the master demon telling the student demon, he's trying to train a demon how to trick people away from what the demon calls the enemy, who is God. And he says, play on their horror of the same old thing. People get very bored with what is called the same old thing. And Christianity has been called the same old thing. You know, the same belief systems that people with powdered wigs and corsets used to believe in the Victorian era, not today. So play the horror of the same old thing. When in fact the reality is this: every system of belief, whether it's secular or theistic, at some point places its faith in you, as you're the one who can do enough good things to please God, as be the one who can achieve enlightenment through whatever means you can do it, or even educate yourself into a Star Trek-like utopian existence. All these things place their faith in you. They're all the same old thing. Christianity tells you something revolutionary, and I would even dare say scandalous, is that you're not worthy of trusting. And I said it yesterday, it's kind of a weird recruiting poster, right? You're not good, join us. It's weird. But Jesus specifically says that out of the heart come evil thoughts, theft, adultery, murder, false testimony, slander, and these things. That is true. Can you actually deny that, humanly speaking? If I could put your thoughts and my thoughts for the past 24 hours on this screen for everybody to see, how many of you would be okay with it and feel that you wouldn't be judged? If your thought life is that bad, I wonder how much our actual emotional and action life is in private. Christianity makes a statement about human condition, and that as but one view, there's many areas, is how it corresponds to truth. But then there's the coherence test. Everything else that it says has to be coherent. Its doctrines have to make sense in light of its other doctrines and ideas. And so you can test these things. And finally, I would say this. Christianity makes an interesting claim. Jesus says in John chapter 2, the religious leaders challenge Jesus' authority, and they say, by what authority do you do these things? Basically saying, who do you think you are? And he says, destroy this temple, meaning his body, and I will raise it up again in 3 days, bodily. Now, if Jesus wanted to be a guy who could believe esoterically, he would have said, I will raise spiritually. Because how can you falsify that, right? You can't say he was right or wrong because you can't see it. Oh, he raised spiritually, and you can create a following that way pretty easily. Jesus didn't do that. He was brave enough to tell you, I'm going to give you a falsifiable test. If I die, and he said, when I die, I will raise from the dead, bodily. And that either will be true or will be false, and you can know it. So if it didn't happen, don't believe him. But if it did happen, who else should you believe? People often ask me this question in a different form. Why do you trust Jesus as the only way? And here's what I say. This is what I get down to. And the evidence of the resurrection, I think, is aplenty, and it's probably already been given during the course of this week. Why do I trust Jesus? Because he died and rose from the dead, and guys who rise from the dead have credibility. Every other worldview denies his resurrection as a matter of its theological importance. And so if you want to know, should he be trusted, look into the historical, falsifiable, but I think actually verified evidence of his resurrection. He gives you an objective test for truth. And if that happened, then he should be believed.
Thank you for that answer. And you know what? You never know about the wigs and the corsets that you talked about. We never thought that 90s high-waisted denim would come back, and look at us now. On to you, Dr. Durston. This question came in. So how do I engage with a question that says, well, you can believe in what you want to believe, and I'll believe in what I want to believe? Doesn't it just shut down conversation?
Well, I think it a lot hinges on what ABDU MURRAY has just said with regard to correspondence theory of truth, and that is, the real important question is what I believe actually true or not? Does it correspond to the spiritual reality that is out there? And I think in any discussion, it's not just about what do you believe and what do I believe, and let's see if we can all get along together. I think the more important question is, what do you and I believe, so we can sort of understand where we're coming from, but what is actually true? What is that spiritual reality out there, and how do our beliefs correspond to that? Because at the end of the day, there may be a lot at stake to be, and if Christianity is true, there is your whole eternal destiny is at stake, your relationship with God's at stake. And from there I would move on to something that he just said, like I would examine the central figure of whatever religion you're discussing and ask the question, why should I believe they were telling the truth? Mm-hmm. And in the case of Jesus Christ, there were the ancient prophecies that he fulfilled, which either were falsifiable or verifiable, and they included the resurrection from the dead, which has just been mentioned, and there's good historiographical evidence for that. I'd refer people to Michael Lacona's book, Resurrection of Jesus, and his historiographical approach.
Thank you. So it's really important to understand that belief is not the most important thing. It's truth. And we have a whole book resource at the back, and so we would love to get some of those in your hands if you have further questions. Thank you, Dr. Durston. Here's one more question I want to just give to both of you. This is kind of big. If Jesus is the only way, why did he come at a particular moment in history? And what about all those people who died before Jesus came, or those from other religions who have never heard of Jesus? How can he be the one truth for all?
Mm-hmm. That's a very powerful question, because it plays on the idea of justice and fairness, and how can this be true if it seems so limited in one sense? I'll say this though. First of all, just in a strict logical sense, it's what's called a non sequitur. That Jesus is the only way has nothing to do with how many people believe it, or had a chance to believe it. Gravity is a force of nature. It's true even though for the most part of human history we had no idea about it. It doesn't mean it's false because not everybody knows it. It just means that not everybody knows it. Now, that doesn't satisfy our sense of fairness. I'm just telling you, logically speaking, it doesn't falsify the claim that Jesus is the only way because not everybody knows he's the only way. It doesn't mean, it's a non sequitur. Those are not joined, logically speaking. However, if you're talking about a Christian God who actually wants all to be saved, now you're thinking, okay, there's something different here. I would ask the same question of any other religious system. Not everybody heard of your system before. What do you think? And well, good people go to heaven. Good personism, by the way, is the largest religion in the world. Good personism says that good people go to heaven because, well, they're good people. And I think that betrays the idea. That doesn't correspond to reality, because who is actually good enough for something like that, for heaven? I think none of us actually qualify. But what I would say is this, is that if I'm asking why questions about God, and someone asked me this question yesterday, actually, after the event, why did it all have to happen 2,000 years ago? Why didn't it happen towards the end of the world, or right after Adam and Eve fell, or whatever it might be? Why then? My answer is this: whenever you ask why questions, why would God do this? Now I'm actually venturing into the mind of God and actually saying, I know why God did something. That's pretty dangerous, because I don't have the mind of God, and I don't pretend to know why he does what he does in the timing he knows it in. I'm perfectly safe in that particular instance saying, I don't know. I don't. However, I can say this: I can get implications from the facts of history. So if you look at the biblical narrative of belief, Adam and Eve are created, and what happens is God walks and talks with them in the cool of the day of the garden. There's that sense of intimacy, of relationship with him. And so it's not like they've never heard of God or heard about even the plan he might have. I imagine they talked about more than the nice weather at Eden. Probably talked about other things as well. So they knew something about this. They fall. God provides a redemptive sacrifice. He actually kills an animal and covers their nakedness with the animal skin. not plants, but actually an animal, to show that there's a sacrifice coming. There's a need for redemption here. They teach that, presumably, to their children. And in fact, two of them, one of them gets it wrong, and the other one gets it right. So we already know it's perpetuated. Then there's the Noahic covenant. And as people begin to spread, and the population begins to spread, they're all looking forward to a Redeemer, a Messiah. In fact, the oldest book of the Bible likely ever written is Job, not Genesis. And that in Job, though he is undergoing suffering, he says, though he slay me, yet I will rejoice, for I know my Redeemer lives. So the whole message of the Bible of redemption from sin is carried throughout humanity. Now, people can start to skew it and ignore it or choose their own paths, as we are wont to do. We love to find not 1,000 ways to God, but 1,001, and 1,002, and 1,004. There are literally, I would think, 7 billion different opinions on how do you get to salvation if we weren't to actually have a standard by which we go about. So we see this throughout history. Jesus actually makes a claim about people who came before him. When the Jews were asking him a question about his divine authority, he says, Abraham saw my day and was glad. They looked forward to a future redemption of the Messiah. Did they have every detail? Probably not. But they had some level of detail. In fact, in the Abrahamic story, where Abraham takes his son Isaac up to the mountain to sacrifice him, Isaac himself asks his father, we have the wood, we have the oil, we have the supplies for the sacrifice, but where is the sacrifice? And Abraham says, God will provide. It's a future look to what's to come. So we see throughout history, they're looking forward to a salvation that comes from the Messiah. All the prophetic utterances from David and Isaiah and Ezekiel about the Messiah to come are what's going to come. They're looking forward to the redemption that will come. And Jesus, being the eternal, the human who is born, but the eternal who is given, the Son is given, has that ability to affect time backwards in terms of salvation and forwards in terms of salvation. Now, the question about whether those who've never heard before, that's a little more thorny. Someone might say that seems unfair. I have a couple of answers to this, and just bear with me just for a moment, and then I'll turn it over. Dr. Durston, I often think that we say that with a little bit of an arrogance, that what about those who never heard? Paul says first that creation itself screams out that there is something behind all of this. And as a scientist, Dr. Durston, I think you can attest that there's adequate evidence to know that something's behind all this. Whenever you see intelligibility, you see intelligence. So there's the first, that there is a God who exists. The second thing is that oftentimes, and I've seen story upon story upon story, I know people like this who have never heard the gospel before or never had a chance to hear it because their country is closed to it, and yet somehow God breaks in. Either he sends something, and believe it or not, on television, but oftentimes through visions and dreams. I know the story of an Afghani woman who, this is pre-Taliban stuff, she was going through a divorce and she was losing her children and all these things, and her husband was taking all that, and she walked out of the courthouse and she literally said, Jesus, please help me. And she stopped in her tracks and, why did I say that? Why did I say that? Oh my goodness, I blasphemed. God's cursing me, God's cursing me. And that night she had a dream of a cave with a cage over, the cage door over the cave. And a figure is emerging from the cave, and she's trying to push the figure back into the cave. She doesn't know who this is, but she wants him to escape, but doesn't want him to escape, and she doesn't know what she's seeing. And then on the television, she finally sees something about Jesus' resurrection in the slightest bit way. She says, that's the man of my dream. And she became a believer that day. Happens all over the world, all the time, all the time. In our arrogance, we think that we have to be the ones who disseminate the message. And the reality of it is that God gives you the opportunity, the graciousness to be able to be a vehicle of truth and justice and his message, but he doesn't need you to do it. He can replace you pretty fast when it comes down to that. He does it oftentimes despite our efforts, and we mess it up, but he also breaks in amazing ways, I think. There's other philosophical answers, but I would say that why God does it 2,000 years ago instead of today, I don't know. But I think there's historical context as well, that God overcame the Roman Empire, not by force, not by shedding people's blood, but by shedding his own. And that actually is a powerful reminder of what we need to see today.
I think we've actually come to the end of our time. We want to be respectful of the lectures that you have to go to, but both Abdu and Dr. Durston are around. There's lots more questions that came in, so please come up and ask them. Just as I hand it back over to Logan, I want to just remind you guys, we would love to hear from you. We want to keep doing events like this. We want to hear if they're helpful. If you haven't had a chance yet, please take some time to fill out our comment card. And I think what we can end on today was that, yes, there are big questions of what of those who will never hear. But I believe we all heard something very clear today, and we heard some tests of truth. And we now, at least, have some sort of responsibility to go, what will I do with this evidence? So thank you for taking the time to listen, and Logan, we'll hand it over to you.
Nice.